Now that our icon has been broken up into its separate components, we can now start to animate it. Now this is where subjectivity kicks in, because the way we animate this trophy is really entirely up to our own brains. And so the way that I animate this wouldn't necessarily be the way that you would animate this. And that's what's awesome about motion graphic design, is that the subjectivity gives a lot of room for creativity. Now for this exercise, I want you to animate it like I would. You'll have a chance to animate your own icons later. But let's go ahead and start to break this down and adjust the anchor points to suit our needs. Now I'm going to come down and I'm going to click on my star layer. I'm going to want this star to kind of scale and spin from the center of the star itself. And notice here, the anchor point is the center of the icon as a whole. But now we've broken this up into its separate components. We should add the anchor points to meet the needs of the separate components, not the icon as a whole. So let's come up to our anchor point tool. And let's come down here to our anchor point, and let's click and drag this to the center of the star. You could hold Control and snap it, but if your mask wasn't perfectly centered on the star, which odds are it's not going to snap to the exact center. So for this, I'm just going to eyeball it. That looks pretty good. Now let's come down to our base top. Base top, I'm going to bring the anchor point to the top of my mask right there. Base bottom, which I recognize now, I never named base bottom. Going to select my base layer and change this to base bottom. And let's move the anchor point for base bottom to be in the center of this rectangle, right about there. Come up to cup. The anchor point for cup looks pretty good where it's at. It's kind of the center of gravity for the entire cup. But I'm actually going to bring this up to the center of the star as well. So that way it can kind of move on the same pivot point as the star. Left handle, I'm going to bring this to the joining point over here to the side. And right handle, same thing, but the other side. Good. So now we have our anchor points met. Let's start to animate. I'm going to start with the star. I want this star to scale from nothing and scale in while rotating. So I'm going to bring up my transform properties, but I want to teach you guys some keyboard shortcuts that are going to make this a lot easier. There are 4 keyboard shortcuts that bring up the individual transform properties for a layer. If you click on your star layer and hit R on the keyboard, that brings up the rotation. If you hit S on your keyboard, that brings up scale. If you hit P on your keyboard, that brings up position. And if you hit T on your keyboard, that brings up opacity, or you could think of it as T for transparency. Those 4 keys, R, S, P, and T, are really great shortcuts to help you quickly animate, but also to isolate the individual transform properties to make everything a little cleaner. I'm going to start with scale, so I'm going to hit S on my star layer. I'm going to drop a keyframe by clicking the stopwatch at 0 seconds for the star. I'm going to get out my selection tool so I can make some adjustments here. I want my star to start at 0, so I'm going to select one of my scale properties and just type in 0 and hit enter. And because they're linked, it's going to scale proportionally. The star has disappeared because it's now infinitesimally small at 0% scale. Now I want to come over here to the 20 frame mark, and I want this to scale back up to 100. There it is. So from 0 to 20 frames, it scales up back to 100. But I want this to kind of animate with some character. I want this to kind of overshoot the scale, meaning I want it to kind of come in, scale a lot, and then come back down. So I'm actually going to create a third keyframe here at about 120 scale. And we can see now it starts from 0, comes up to 120, and comes back down to 100. So if I play this, it comes in, comes up, and comes down. Now I'm going to set my work area at about 2 seconds. I'm going to hit N on the keyboard there to set my work area so I can watch this loop if I need to. Now, I don't like the way that looks because there's no ease applied. So I'm going to apply ease to my last two keyframes here by lassoing the two of them and hitting F9 on the keyboard. Let's watch that. Feels better, but it's kind of slow. I want it to be faster, so I'm going to move my keyframes in to make this a bit faster. Ooh, that feels nice. I'm going to drag this last keyframe out a little bit. Yeah. So the whole thing now is just shy of 20 frames. It comes in, overshoots, and scales down. I also want to add some rotation to this. So now I'm going to hit R on the keyboard with my star layer selected. Select my stopwatch for rotation. But I want the rotation now to match the keyframes for my scale. But since I'm using my keyboard shortcuts, I can't see the scale keyframes we already have. Well, there's another keyboard shortcut that I've mentioned in earlier tutorials, but it really comes in handy here. It's the U keyboard shortcut. Remember, U kind of stands for unfold. It unfolds any property currently that has keyframes. So if I hit U, I can now see my scale and rotation, allowing me to work with both. I want the star to rotate 180 degrees at the halfway point here of its scale, and then rotate back to its resting place here. So at this middle scale point, I'm going to type in, under the degrees, 180. So now it's going to rotate 180 degrees at the halfway point. And then at the ending scale, I want this to go back down to 0. Let's watch this. So it rotates in 180 degrees and then reverses back to its resting place. Now, likewise, I want to add ease to these last two keyframes. Lasso both, hit F9, and let's check that out. That's nice. So it scales up, rotates, and then scales back down and rotates the other direction. Now, what we haven't adjusted here is the graph editor for these points. I want this to be a bit more, a bit less rigid, more than it even is. So I'm going to select my scale keyframes here and come into the graph editor. Now I want this scale part to have some kind of a sticky center where it kind of hovers or hangs up on this center keyframe and then eases out here. So when I play this back now, hard to notice, but now it's going to scale up, hang on its scale, and then come back down a bit more. Let's do the same thing with rotation. I'm going to select my middle rotation ease keyframe here and come back to the graph editor. Same thing. I'm going to drag these two out to create kind of a sticky center, and then ease out the ending as well. Ah, yeah, now you can see that. Kind of comes up and hangs and then sticks back down. Now, when you adjust the ease in the graph editor, it changes the speed of everything because we're changing the speed graph, which means you may need to readjust the distance of your keyframes, the timing. I'm going to drag this out, for example, to give it a bit more time to do its thing. That looks nice on the front end. I want to give the back end a bit more time. That looks nice. All right, so that's our star. Let's go ahead and start to animate the handles and the base. Now, I know I want my handles and my base to kind of suck into the middle of my cup. I kind of want them to emerge from the inside of the cup. Well, this is an easy thing to start. So I'm going to come back here to 0. And I'm going to select my handles by holding Control or Command and selecting both. And my base bottom and base top. And then hit P on the keyboard to bring up the position for all of those. Now, the way it's designed here, I want it to be its final resting place. So I'm actually going to bring my playhead over here toward 1 second. and drop keyframes for the positions at all of those. So that way it kind of cements this design over here to the right. Then I'm going to take my playhead back to 0. Now I can adjust these however I want, and they'll always end up the way that they should at 1 second. I'm going to click off of those layers and do one at a time. My handle right, I want to have inside of my cup like this. Handle left, same thing, have it inside of my cup. Base bottom and base top, I want to move up as well. Now the base bottom is going to do the exact same thing as base top, which means we could probably parent the position of base bottom to base top. So I'm going to turn off my keyframe for base bottom and pick whip base bottom to base top, allowing me now to animate only base top, but base bottom goes with it. So I'm going to bring this up to about there. So you can see what we've done. We've just kind of collapsed all the layers inside of the cup, and so now they kind of just emerge out. But we have an issue. This is a PNG. Everything is transparent, which means we can see the layers inside of the cup. It's not what we want. We want it to look like it's behind the cup, but we don't have that luxury because the cup is transparent. So we need to actually draw a new shape that's going to effectively fill the cup. Let's make a new shape layer. Layer, new, shape layer. I'm going to get out my pen tool. I want my fill to be white and there to be no stroke applied. And again, we're drawing a shape here, not a mask. So we're going to work with our star icon. I'm going to zoom in here and I'm just going to click and begin to draw a shape that fills the inside of the cup. Now you don't have to be exact here because this is going to live underneath the stroke. So for example, I'm going to drag this underneath cup. And we can see now that it kind of lives behind the stroke that we've already had. Now we can see the handles still because our layer order isn't proper. So I'm going to select both the cup and the new shape that we've made and drag this to the very top. So again, if I turn off my alpha channel, you can see what we've done. We've made a shape that just fills the cup. Now it's white, which makes it blend in with the alpha color we've chosen already for our composition, which is white. You may run into issues later if you want like a blue design, but again, shapes are easily changed in terms of their color. Let's go ahead and rename this shape layer Cup Fill. And because we want the fill to do everything that the cup will, we're going to parent the fill to the cup itself. We haven't animated the cup yet, but once we do, we want the fill to do exactly the same. Now there's an issue here because what can't we see? The star. Because our star layer is at the bottom. So again, this is where layer order starts to matter. Let's take our star layer and drag it above the cup to be the very top layer. And now we can see the animation starting to unfold here. Now, the timing of my handles and my base are no good. I had it set to 1 second just as some arbitrary time in the future, but now we get to retime these. So I want my handles to be rather quick, but I want them to come in as the star is already animating. So I want there to kind of be a hierarchy in terms of when these come in. Star first, then the handles. So I want my handles, I'm going to lasso the keyframes for both of my handles and drag them to start when the star is halfway through its rotation. See this here. And I want them to end differently. So I want to bring their ending keyframes to be a bit closer, and I'm going to add ease to both of them. Let's see what this does. Oh, not bad. Now I'm going to adjust the graph editor for both of the ending keyframes for the handles because I want them to be identical. So with both of the ending keyframes for the handles selected, I'm going to come into my graph editor. I'm going to zoom in here on my ending keyframe, and I'm going to drag the handle out, again, not up, just out, to change its influence, maybe to around 60%. Let's see what that does. That feels nice. Now I want one handle to come in before the other. I want the right handle to emerge before the left handle. So I'm just going to lasso both keyframes for my left handle and just stagger these a little bit. There we go. Now I want my bases to move after the handles come in. So I'm going to select both of the keyframes for the base top and drag it over. And again, we're not adjusting anything on base bottom yet because it's parented to base top. So whatever we adjust on base top, base bottom will follow. Same thing, I want it to start there, but I want it to shorten the duration and add ease to the end. Now I'm a fan of everything kind of lining up. So you can see here the handle starts on track with the scale and rotation of the star. I want it to end there as well. So I'm going to bring this keyframe here and then shorten this one by a few frames. That way they're equal. Likewise, I want the base to start at the end of my first handle, and the base can end arbitrarily here. That's just going to allow some visual continuity to take place. Not bad. Let's add some ease, some heavier ease using the graph editor for our base top. Let's select that keyframe, come to the graph editor, and let's crank this handle a bit. The influence is about 60 to 70%. Looks nice. But we've separated the base. And because base bottom is parented to base top, the position will be the same. But we have an issue right here. We can see the base bottom through the cup because its width is wider than the cup. Well, let's animate then the scale of base bottom. I'm going to hit S when I have base bottom selected to bring up the scale. I want the scale to start at the start of the position for base top. Turn on the scale for the keyframe for scale. And I want to just scale my x-axis. So I'm going to unlink the scale parameters here by clicking this little chain link. And I'm going to just change the x scale for base bottom. I'm going to bring it in. As it comes down, oops, we can see there's an issue here. So I want this to scale to start at the width of the top part of this kind of curve here, which means I just created an accidental second keyframe. Not a big deal. I can click and drag a keyframe and overwrite an existing keyframe by overlapping those. So now that's been overwritten. So there's the scale. I want it now to scale out, overshoot, and then come back to 100%. So I'm going to have this scale beyond, overshoot, to around 120%. And then at the final resting place of the base, have this go back down to 100%. And lasso the last two keyframes, hit F9 to add some ease. Let's select one of the eased keyframes and come to our graph editor, and let's do the same thing here. Let's create a sticky start, or a sticky middle, and then have it ease at the end. Influence is around 60%. Let me zoom out here and let's watch this in its entirety. Now this feels a little weird because the scale for base bottom is happening as it's coming down. I want to delay this a bit more, so I'm going to lasso my first two scale keyframes for base bottom and drag them forward a bit. That just delays that scale a bit. That feels better. So now the last thing we need to animate is the cup. So everything right now is kind of stemming from this cup here, and it's looking rather good. You'd never guess this was a stationary PNG. So let's animate the cup. Let's come to our cup layer, and I want the cup to do the exact same scale as the star, but come in just after the star. So I'm going to hit S on my cup layer to bring up the scale. I'm going to start a keyframe for the scale at around close to the halfway point of the star's movement. We'll adjust all these after the fact. And I want the cup to start at 0% scale. And again, the cup fill is scaling with it. Have no fear that we see all these bundled up layers here. Just like the star, I want the cup to overshoot, so around 120, and then rest back to 100. And just like the star, we'll select the last two keyframes, add ease, and adjust them in the graph editor to create the sticky middle and the sticky end. Good, but now our timing's a little off because the handles now are appearing before the cup is done animating, which means we just need to move everything down. This is easy to do. We can just select all of our layers by selecting handle right, holding shift and selecting the bottom, and hit U on the keyboard twice to make sure that we can see every keyframe that we currently have. Now, draw a bounding box around all these keyframes, and you can move them all down. So I want the handle to start animating a little bit after, like as it's scaling back down to 100. Star, cup, handle, handle, base. Let's watch that again. Looks nice. But last issue, we can see the groupings before the cup emerges. This takes me to a property about layers inside of the layer panel that we haven't talked about yet. And that is we can trim layers in the layer panel, meaning I can hover over the beginning or end of a layer, click and drag its clip to a new starting point. Wherever I've trimmed it is where it's going to show up at the start. So let me Control Z here. I can select all of my layers that I want to have start later, and I can click and trim them all to the playhead by just clicking and dragging them. So now nothing's appearing. I don't see the groupings because they're all trimmed, and now they animate one after the other. Let's watch this. Now, I don't like that I can see the cup animate through the star, which means we need to add a fill to the star itself. So I'm going to come to the final resting place of the star. I'm going to create a new shape layer. Layer, new, shape layer. And with my pen tool selected, we're going to draw a shape, not a mask. The fill will be white, no stroke applied. I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm just going to draw a very crude outline of my star here. The rounded points don't matter because it's going to live behind the stroke. So we want this now to be behind the star stroke. And I'll rename this Star Fill. And just like the cup fill, I'm going to parent the star fill to the star layer. That way now, as it rotates and moves, I'll bring the alpha back so you can see it, the fill does everything the parent star does, giving us now a full animation complete with individual sections and fills as it moves. In the next tutorial, we're going to move on to pre-compositions and animate this even further.